Good afternoon. I hope you all had the opportunity to pay your respects to the brave men and women who have given their lives for our freedom yesterday on Memorial Day. I want to begin by recapping the incredible historic trip that the President and the First Lady have just concluded, because it truly was an extraordinary week for America and our people. In just 9 days, the President traveled across Europe and the Middle East and interacted with nearly 100 foreign leaders. It was an unprecedented first trip abroad, just 4 months into this administration, and it shows how quickly and decisively the President is acting to strengthen alliances, to form new partnerships, and to rebuild America's standing in the world. We've never seen before at this point in a presidency such sweeping reassurance of American interest and the inauguration of a foreign policy strategy designed to bring back the world from growing dangers and perpetual disasters brought on by years of failed leadership. President Trump started in Saudi Arabia, beginning his first foreign trip as president in the nation that's the custodian to the two holiest sites in the Islamic faith. The president was greeted on the tarmac by the King of Saudi Arabia and received with incredible graciousness by the kingdom and its leaders throughout his stay. The president's address to the leaders of more than 50 Arab and Muslim nations was a historic turning point that people will be talking about for many years to come. He did exactly as he promised in his inaugural address, united the civilized world in the fight against terrorism and extremism. The president was very direct in calling on the leaders of the region to drive out the terrorists and the extremists from their midst and to isolate the Iranian regime that supports so much of this violence. He let American allies know exactly what they can expect from us going forward, what he called, quote, a principled realism rooted in common values and shared interest. He laid out the case in persuasive detail for why the Muslim world must take the lead in combating radicalization. And he concluded by saying that if those nations go forward, quote, unified and determined to do what it takes to destroy the terror that threatens our world, then there is no limit to the great future our citizens will have. The president's historic speech was met with nearly universal praise. Former CIA Director Jim Woolsey called it, quote, a courageous speech. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich said in the Washington Post that we have to look back decades to, quote, find a comparatively dramatic moment in the history of U.S. foreign policy. And former Democratic Representative Jane Harman said that she, quote, loved the idea that he's going to the fount of all three major religions. Countless Arab allies also praised the president's leadership on this visit. President al-Sisi of Egypt said that President Trump is, quote, a unique personality that is capable of doing the impossible. The Saudi foreign minister said that, quote, this is the beginning of a turning point in the relationship between the United States and the Arab and Islamic world. King Salman and other key allies also gave extraordinary speeches at the summit, underscoring just how much President Trump has done to rally the world against terrorism. We cannot overlook the significance of so many leaders of Muslim countries coming together to recognize the need to fight extremists. This was a historic event in that regard alone. King Salman said he shares the president's determination to, quote, renounce extremism and work on countering terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. King Abdullah of Jordan agreed that, quote, the grave challenges of terrorism and extremism demands coordination and global action at every level. He stated that, quote, we are all accountable for our commitment to fight radicalization in all of its forms. The visit also included historic economic development deals for the United States, totaling well over $500 billion in the creation of tens of thousands of American jobs. These deals include an immediate $110 billion investment, which will grow to $350 billion over the next 10 years in defense cooperation from Saudi Arabia that will further enable Muslim troops to take on a greater role in fighting terrorism. The president also participated in the launch of a new task force to block terror funding in the Gulf, the opening of a new global center for combating extremist ideology, and more than 30 commercial deals that include companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, GE, Dow, Honeywell, Emerson, Alcoa, and Cisco, among others, that will result in an additional $270 billion of Saudi investment in American businesses and American jobs. The president then went to Israel, where he was received with incredible warmth. He strengthened America's unbreakable bonds with Israel, made the first ever visit by a sitting American president to the Western Wall, and gave a highly praised address at the Israel Museum as part of a continuing effort to rally nations together in the fight against terrorism and common enemies. The moving address spoke of a future in which, quote, children around the world will be able to live without fear, to dream without limits, and to prosper without violence. He said, I ask this land of promise to join me in fight our common enemies, to pursue our shared values, and to protect the dignity of every child of God. The president also visited Yad Vashem to memorialize the victims of the Holocaust and to pledge never again. The president met with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Abbas to advocate for a renewed push for peace, which they both agreed they were prepared to work towards. He also discussed with both leaders how to increase cooperation against terrorism. Prime Minister Netanyahu said, quote, for the first time in my life, I see real hope for change. And a correspondent at one of the leading Israel publications wrote that, quote, in the short space of 3 days, Trump carried out a semi-revolution. From Israel, the president traveled to Rome, where he met with Pope Francis at the Vatican. They had a very productive conversation about combating ISIS and other terrorist groups, protecting religious liberty, and numerous other issues. The president and the First Lady were incredibly honored by the visit. The president then attended the NATO summit in Brussels, where he boldly stood up for American taxpayers and our common defense by calling on other NATO countries to pay their fair share on a speech delivered with the leaders of all of NATO's countries all present. Hardworking Americans saw a leader represent them and their security on the international stage. The president also urged NATO to adapt the alliance to more effectively combat terrorism. Later in the meeting, the member states unanimously agreed on those two priorities, and the Secretary General was extremely complimentary of the president's work to dramatically strengthen the alliance by getting member states to increase their contributions. Finally, the president traveled to the G7 summit in Sicily, where he and other leaders discussed how to better promote prosperity and security for each of their countries. Those meetings were marked by outstanding success that we see reflected in the communique that was issued. They include a strong statement that G7 nations will stand against unfair trade practices and a commitment to fostering a true level playing field. The G7 leaders also endorsed the right of sovereign nations to control their borders and endorsed in that communique the policy outlined by President Trump to seek resettlement of refugees as close as possible to their home countries so that they can be part of an eventual rebuilding. This language on migration and refugees was a major shift in policy towards the shift of the president. The G7 formally also condemned the use of chemical weapons, and needless to say, the president's leadership was critical in setting those priorities for the nation. In addition, the president also met with Prime Minister Abe of Japan. The two agreed on the need for enhanced sanctions with respect to North Korea. The president concluded his trip with an address to the service members and their family at Naval Station Sigonella to thank them for their service on Memorial Day weekend and to deliver another strong message about the unity in the fight against terrorism. Then yesterday, President Trump spoke at Arlington National Cemetery for Memorial Day services and visited the grave sites of many of our fallen heroes. This was an extraordinarily successful and historic 9-day trip the president took. He accomplished the return of a strong America to international affairs, rallied civilized nations of the world against terrorism, took real steps towards peace in the Middle East, and renewed our alliances on the basis of both shared interest and shared burdens. The trip sets the stage for a much more safe and prosperous nation here at home and a more peaceful world for all. We're back at home now, and the president and his cabinet are moving full steam ahead on the president's agenda. As the president noted this weekend, his plan for the most significant tax reform in decades continues to progress, led by Secretary Mnuchin and NEC Director Cohn. While the president was away, the team here held several meetings with members in leadership. In particular, Secretary Mnuchin met separately with the House Ways and Means Committee, Republican and Democrat members, the Freedom Caucus, and the Republican Study Committee. The Vice President also discussed tax reform with multiple members and with leadership during his regular visits to Capitol Hill. We'll begin holding industry listening sessions next week, providing an opportunity for business leaders and job creators to give us their inputs on what reforms are necessary to allow us to grow jobs and the economy. This morning, the president met with Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Pruitt. One of the topics that they discussed, of course, was the president's upcoming decision on the Paris Climate Accords. As I've told you overseas, this is the subject that the president is spending a great deal of time on, and one that he spoke to the G7 members about during their meetings. Ultimately, he wants a fair deal for the American people, and he will have an announcement coming on that shortly. Also today, the president's trade representative, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, is having several meetings with representatives from the Vietnamese government, including the Prime Minister and the Trade Minister, ahead of tomorrow's visit between the president and the Prime Minister. U.S. Trade Representative will have readouts on those meetings available for you this afternoon. Ambassador Lighthizer will also be speaking at the Chamber of Commerce Gala this evening for the Vietnamese Prime Minister. That speech should be available via the U.S. Chamber's Facebook page. During his speech, Ambassador Lighthizer will highlight the developments of our bilateral relationships with Vietnam over the past 2 decades, while underscoring the work ahead in addressing the challenges presented by the recent sharp increase in our trade deficit with Vietnam. As the President has made abundantly clear, trade deficits and unfair trade practices have disproportionately hit American workers. Through a robust and varied trade agenda, this administration is strengthening our important relationships with partners like Vietnam by leveling the playing field with American businesses throughout the world. And with that, take your questions.